I had a spare few minutes, so I want to quickly take you all through AutoRAG, how easy it is to set up, and explain a little bit about the product, because I've used AWS Knowledge Bases quite a lot in my day job, and this effectively is doing the same sort of job. For anyone not familiar, AutoRAG is effectively a managed RAG pipeline. So you don't need to do pretty much anything to enable RAG in your application when you're using AutoRAG. You can give it all of your content from an R2 bucket, as you can see on the screen. In the future, you'll be able to do web crawler or from a D1 database or perhaps other sources in the future. It all gets loaded into Vectorize, which is Cloudflare's vector database. It will generate the embeddings for it. It will obviously store the kind of raw data itself and chunk the documents. So if you have large documents, you want to separate them into smaller chunks, which we'll get to later on. And once that's done, you can then either use it purely to retrieve the relevant chunks during RAG. So before you call, let's say, an OpenAI model or Anthropic or even Workers AI, you can just retrieve the raw chunks. You could use that for something like semantic search, for example, on your website. Or you can also have AutoRAG generate a response for you by giving it a prompt. It will then do the actual RAG process, which is retrieving the relevant chunks based on the user's query. And then it will use the prompt you give it to kind of take those sources and generate your response from an LM. So let's go through this quickly. We pick our R2 bucket. I've just made a very quick bucket here to test with. If you're looking for AutoRAG, it's on the AI menu on the left, just under here. And just pick the bucket you want and put some content in it, markdown files, whatever you like. On the next screen, you pick how you want to generate the indexes. And this is using an embedding model. It will use Workers AI, and there's only two available. So the default is this BGE M3, which I think is the newest model from that family. I think it came out maybe last month. And you have a slightly older BGE model as well. I'm just going to leave this default. I think in future, I think you'll see more come. And it'll be interesting to see how more open source ones come, because I think the embedding model versus the LLM model is very competitive in the open source space. So it'll be interesting to see how that is. And it gives you a quick overview here of the size. So the dimensions is how many numbers are generated for each embedding. So 1024 means you get an array of 24 numbers. And the modality. So at the moment it only supports text no matter what you pick, but maybe in future there'll be images. And the metric is what metric or algorithm is used to determine similarity between when you're running a query. So it uses cosine similarity, which is something from like maths. If you're in high school and you remember like angles and things, it plots all these things on a graph, and it can find the ones that are nearest to each other if you were doing it kind of visually. And later on, we'll see kind of the scores and how those play in. But effectively, this is a way of working out what content in your collection is a close match for the user's input query, and it uses cosine similarity for that. We also have chunking. So if you have huge documents, maybe 10,000 tokens long or 10,000 characters, whatever metric you want to use, you don't want to generate an embedding for all 10,000, because the semantic meaning of that huge 10,000 word document is not going to be very well represented by an embedding. So what you want to do is chunk those documents, and it's basically taking that document and breaking it into smaller pieces. And you can configure the size of your chunks that you want to set based on your content, how it's structured, and you can probably just change the chunk size and see how that affects your query. A really easy example to understand how this works is if you had a document that was 1,000 tokens long, you could break that apart into 10 chunks of 100 tokens, and then you get 10 chunks. 100 adds up to 1,000. And then you also want to set, typically, an overlap, because chunking, at least using this kind of chunking, where there are different strategies available, but at the moment it only has these fixed size chunking, it might break a sentence in the middle of a chunk, and then you lose the semantic meaning of that sentence because it's been chunked in the middle. So that first chunk has half a sentence, and the second chunk has the other half of the sentence, but you've lost the meaning. So you can configure an overlap where there's effectively an overlap before and after each chunk that then hopefully doesn't break apart those sentences, because the full sentence hopefully is in one of those chunks. You can probably just leave them as default for now if you're doing this, and then you can play around with it and see how it is. On the next screen, so as I mentioned earlier, you can generate content. So you can generate a response from an LLM using AutoRAG, or you can just use it for retrieval. So if you're just using it for retrieval, this part doesn't matter because you're not ever going to call the LLM to generate a response. At the moment, we have the Llama family of models. It would be nice in future, I think, to see some other models in here, whether we're using external ones or some more that are available from Workers AI. I'm not sure why there aren't all of them. I'm guessing it's probably just a constraint for beta, but I think external models here are going to be a must-have because the likes of OpenAI, Anthropic, etc. are kind of streets ahead of the rest, and Llama can't quite keep it up at the moment. So I think this will restrict its usage a little bit, but it's still nice to have. And then you just connect it to an AI gateway. I don't actually know if there's a reason why it has to create an AI gateway, but at the moment, at least, you have to create one. Maybe I suspect it's probably because when you use the binding, it needs to go via an AI gateway, but I haven't actually checked, so we'll see. Then you have some more configuration options that are only applicable to if you're doing generation. First is query rewrite, and this simply is you can take the input that the user's given you. So imagine like an app where they're asking you questions via a chat or whatever. You can take what the user said and have an LLM rewrite it to something that is better for your use case. So you can give it a system prompt that explains what it's doing. And then rather than a kind of very generic question being passed, it can be kind of tweaked to fit your specific use case and make the question hopefully better, and therefore the results better. But again, you'd have to play around with it to see if it works for your use case, and obviously tweak the prompt as well. Retrieval configuration is very simple. You can control the number of results returned, so anywhere from 1 to 10, and then you can set the match threshold, which is likely the cosine similarity score. Interestingly, cosine similarity goes from -1 to 1. So in this case, I'm guessing they're only allowing you to match ones that are kind of positively related, because anything below 0, I think they're kind of deemed not similar. So maybe that's just helping with the user experience by not letting them select lower than 0, but maybe you want to use it for that purpose. But at least at the moment, you can only select positive matches. And then similarity caching is allowing you to save money by using Cloudflare's cache. And what will happen is when a query comes in, you can avoid using things like the LLM generation, and I assume even retrieving from the likes of Vectorize, by having Cloudflare check the cache first, and you can disable this if you want. And there are some different settings, which you can kind of see here. So the exact match is basically, you'll just see grammatical differences. So what's the weather like today versus what is the weather like today. Strong, which seems like a very sensible default, is where it has high semantic meaning, but the way it's phrased might be a little bit different. So what's the weather like today versus how's the weather today? Pretty similar. So that seems like a reasonable default. And then it gets a bit broader as you go through. So what's the weather like today and tell me today's weather? Not quite the same, so that wouldn't stay in the strong default. And then finally you have loose, which is what's the weather like today and give me the forecast, which are obviously very different things, because give me the forecast doesn't specify the day, so it's very loose. So this is probably going to give you a very high hit rate, but it also might give you kind of a bad hit rate if you like. So you'll have to see how that performs. And there are, when you use this similarity caching, it will tell you whether it's come from cache or whether it's not come from cache when you use it. So again, you can disable it, and same for the query rewrite, this can be disabled as well. I'm going to leave it as default. And that's pretty much it. And then you need to create an API token. That just allows AutoRAG to do what it wants, give it a name, and then it will go off and create. That's it. Hope you enjoyed the video, and yeah.